At this point in the series, I'd like to begin discussing more difficult concepts in metaphysics and philosophy of nature and relate these to natural theology. And there's quite a lot to talk about. For example, in any defense of God's existence, one is likely going to have to talk about such notions as being, becoming, the transcendentals, the problem of universals, substance, accident, essence, existence, eternity, temporality, intellection, volition, power, and so forth. Which is why natural theology is treated at book length by respectable authors. This applies just as well to the atheist, assuming he's serious about having a unified and balanced understanding of reality in all its aspects, which would encompass ontology, epistemology, physics, politics, ethics, psychology, aesthetics, etc., and not being unduly focused on just one of these, such as empirical science, leading to neglect or negation of the others, which would be a sort of intellectual disintegration. For this having of a unified understanding of the whole, and how the diverse aspects of reality relate to the whole, is just part of what it means to have wisdom, which is something we're after in philosophy. This is a series on natural theology, so we approach these issues within metaphysics, not only for their own sake, but with an eye towards reasoning about God with unaided human reason, or what can be said about God philosophically, which is what natural theology is as a science. The topics of this video are metaphysics, being, and the analogy of being, or analogia entis. This analogy of being will be important for subsequent theological points, although, as a matter of discussion, it isn't tied per se to theology, but is drawn instead from metaphysics, and is even apprehended at the level of philosophy of nature. But to talk about the analogy of being, we need to talk a bit about being first, and the science which studies being in its broadest scope, which is metaphysics. Being is both extremely familiar, but also very strange once we start thinking about it. Everything we're presented with in our experience has being, or is, in some way, according to its various modes. We have not only human beings, but other beings like cats, trees, bacteria, tables, chairs, coffee cups, which we say are beings precisely because they exist, or have being, or are real. In terms of systematic study, the sciences are rightly said to study being in some way, usually diverse beings with something in common or from some point of view. The biologist does study being along with the chemist and the psychologist. But what's different about these endeavors is the qualification added on to the sorts of beings that are studied and the point of view. The biologist studies being, but he studies being insofar as it is living being, or being qua living being. A bacterium is of interest to the biologist because it is living being, whereas a glacier is not, because it is not living being, or only peripherally to the extent it affects living being. Even within living being, one can get more restrictive and study only certain sorts of living being, such as a botanist may do, which would only study plant life, or, as we might say, being insofar as it's both living being and plant. But suppose we move in the other direction and get broader in our study. That is, instead of studying being qua living or plant, we remove instead of add those restrictions on the mode of being and just say simply the study of being qua being. This, quote, being qua being, unquote, or, quote, being insofar as it is being, unquote, is the famous Aristotelian formula for what metaphysics is. The study of being simply as being, without further restrictions, such as being qua living being, or being qua chemical substance. Metaphysics, therefore, takes the broadest approach possible to being as the science of being, and will naturally study what must be said about any being whatsoever, most definitely including those encompassed in those fields listed above. Because of its wide scope, it is one of the truest studies of reality, whereas when we say that fields like biology study reality, it is only true to a degree to say that they study reality, because they only study reality as it pertains to living being and not non-living beings. So it's only true to say that they study being in a qualified sense, but not unqualifiedly. Now, it belongs to metaphysics to study the broadest aspects of being even prior to particular things being said of such being. For example, a botanist might go on and start talking about photosynthesis in the plant cell, or in an organelle of this cell, and give all sorts of details, but all these details presuppose the real being of plant cells and of organelles, and of cells more generally, stripping away the plant qualification, which in turn presupposes there's a distinction of some sort between plant and non-plant cells, and it presupposes that there is even such a thing as an actuated mode of being that's cellular, and that there are real activities and things that these cells do. The metaphysician here is going to be concerned with notions like the being, becoming, change, relation of part to whole, general category and further specification, or genus and species, essence, existence, all of which are presupposed for such details about photosynthesis in a plant cell to be intelligible. To say that another way, to deny metaphysical analysis into these notions is to render unintelligible what we say even in specific fields like botany or any empirical science, because this field requires the prior understanding of the above notions. Therefore, there is no such thing as a metaphysics-free empirical science. It literally doesn't exist, and there's just no way to bypass this if you plan on actually saying anything or reasoning about reality. The best one can do is merely verbally say he's bypassing metaphysics, when in fact he is not. In the same vein, it is often claimed, polemically, that metaphysics doesn't study anything, in that it doesn't study reality, or that it studies inventions of the mind which have nothing to do with reality. From what I've said above, this is seen to be false, and even the claim that the notions that metaphysics studies, like being, becoming, essence, existence, cause, etc., are nothing more than products of the mind is itself a metaphysical claim, because it claims to know how the human mind links up with reality, namely that the notions contained in the mind have nothing to do with reality. There's just no avoiding the investigation of these broadest notions if one plans on seriously thinking about reality. Or equivalently, the only way to avoid metaphysics is to stop thinking and talking about reality. The polemic might be that metaphysics means not studying reality, but on the contrary, the man who says metaphysics is nonsense implicitly says that studying reality is nonsense. Having gone over what the science of metaphysics is interested in, how do we approach something like being? First, can being be defined? If it could be defined, I should be able to complete the statement, quote, being is ... unquote. But when I give a definition, you wouldn't be satisfied if you just heard the thing to be defined within the definition, or being used within it. For example, if a definition of man contains man in the definition, it's a bad definition. Now, coming back to being, the problem here is that outside of being is non-being, or nothingness. And to give a definition of being in terms of stuff that isn't being would entail being defined in terms of nothingness, which is absolutely absurd. So being, strictly speaking, cannot be defined. It's too simple and too fundamental of a notion and too all-encompassing of a notion to be defined, and yet we have familiarity with being in spite of this. But how are we to think of being when reflecting upon the comprehensive scope of this notion and in relation to the diverse beings of experience? Let's suppose we think of being as a large class, similar to how we might think of animal as a large class. We'll name the category being, or being in general, and then we stick all the particular beings inside it as we stick all the animals inside the class called animal. We'll take all the cats, dogs, humans, trees, tables, chairs, and sticks, and put them all in this big circle or class named being, and then we've got the whole thing worked out. In this picture, being is just a generic notion, and we stick all of the individual beings inside the big class named being, because they all have being in the same way, just as we stick all the dogs, cats, and men inside the class named animal, because they're all animals in the same way, just with respect to their animality. Whereas the tables and chairs we do not, because tables and chairs aren't animals. But this won't quite work for real being. This is due to the very simple and undeniable fact of the diversification of being. If that picture were correct, then there's no way tables, chairs, cats, dogs, men, and trees could really be distinct beings. In this picture, men and dogs are both the same in that they both have being. But how is the being of the dog to be distinguished from the being of the man? They cannot be distinguished by more of the same thing that they have in common, that is, being. For it makes no sense to say that both dogs and men are distinguished by the very thing that they have in common, namely being. That is, dogs and men are in this category being, so they have that in common. But anything that would differentiate the two would also have to be more being, because outside of being is absolute nothingness. It just makes no sense to say that two things are distinguished because one of the two additionally possesses so-called nothing, whereas the other does not. This picture would seem to imply that being is a sort of monad that cannot be further specified or differentiated, since if it were further specified, it would have to be specified into specific beings by the further addition of nothing, which is the only thing outside of being, which is just preposterous. This is pure madness because it's clear as day that men and dogs are really different, and that being is diversified and not just a monad or a singular unit called being, into which all the seemingly diverse beings collapse. These questions were of great interest to the pre-Socratics, and we moderns often forget to inquire into such questions, thinking that we don't really need to, as though this were obviously some frivolous concern. But it isn't. For really, how can there be diverse beings if real being is thought of as a big class to which everything simply belongs? This absurd conclusion in the face of the obvious diversity of beings means that being is not a general class or a genus, as one of we Thomists would say, which is further specified or inspected, if you will, by additional factors other than what's already in the genus. These additional factors outside the genus are known as the specific difference. For example, dogs and men are clearly both animals, or in the genus animal. But there's something that has to be added to animality, to the genus animal, that allows for the real distinction between dogs and men within the genus. It cannot be more animality that grounds such a distinction, like a man having more animality than a dog. For again, the principle by which they differ cannot be the very thing that they share. It would make no sense at all to say, yes, I think that both dogs and men are animals, but dogs are not men because dogs are animals, and so are men. There has to be something that isn't in animality that grounds the distinction here, something outside the genus, and is added to the genus as a metaphysical composition to allow for specification of the genus into species, or specific sorts of animals. Aristotelians would say that the additional factor, the specific difference here, is rationality, which is added to animality to yield the species man. But the point is that there must be some further specifying factor, which is not just more of the same generic animality to yield this real distinction between dog and man. If there is no further factor, then there's no real objective ground for the distinction in question in things. That is, nothing in the reality of a man that grounds the distinction, in which case dogs aren't really any different than men in extra-mental reality or in things, but perhaps only mentally or by social convention or both. Now, we see that some things are diversified by this specification of a more general class, like animal. But being cannot be diversified by adding on factors outside this genus, which would have to be nothing here, since specification of a genus cannot truly happen by adding in more stuff already in the genus, more being here. Go back to the example between the dog and the man. To sum that up, being cannot be a genus, because then individuals of the species would have to be composed of genus and specific difference. But the specific difference must be outside the genus, and outside of being is non-being, or nothing. Therefore, there is no foundation for species, or specific beings within this alleged genus, or general being. And we conclude that being is not a genus. So the conception in which you imagine a large general class named being, with all the specifications and individuals thrown in it, doesn't quite reflect real being, because then there's no basis for its diversification into specific sorts of being, which we clearly experience. Said another way, being is not a generic notion. It's what's called a transcendental, in the sense of the transcendentals, not in the Kantian sense, since it would even have to be said of all genera, even the genus animal, or of any other genus, and therefore transcends generality. To put it another way, being is more general than any genus. This conclusion that being is not a genus is a major insight, and leads to a very interesting conclusion, and one major Thomistic doctrine, the analogy of being, or analogia entis. But to get there requires going over the three ways in which predication happens of many things. That is, when one thing is said or predicated of something else. For example, I am a man, in which case I predicate a man of myself. Now, either the same term can be predicated of many things in exactly the same way, or not. If it is predicated in exactly the same way, this is called univocal predication. For example, when I say that I'm a man and that you're a man, the a man is being said of both you and me in exactly the same way. It would be totally bizarre to deny this, because I'd be suggesting that a man, when it's said of me, means something peculiar to me or perhaps peculiar to you. The other possibility that the predication is non-univocal, that is, not said in exactly the same way of both things, is itself divided into two possibilities. Either the predication is in totally different ways, or it is said not in totally different ways. If it's being said in totally different ways, we call this equivocal predication. For example, when I say, this is a bat, I could mean bat as in a baseball bat, or bat as in the animal. Bat here is being used equivocally. As you can see, equivocation is often associated with puns or chance occurrences in language, like the bat example. Now, the third option is predication neither in the same exact way, nor in totally different ways, and this is called analogical predication. You can see it's a middle ground between predicating univocally and predicating equivocally, or a mean between the two. That is, predicating of many in the way which is neither totally the same nor totally different, but alike in some way, but also different in some way. An example is when I say, first, this man is very good, and secondly, this music is very good, or this is a good triangle, thirdly. Now, when good is said of each, it's clearly not univocal, since what makes a man good is not the same as what makes a piece of music good. That is, a musical work may be good because it has balanced orchestration, nice tone color, a creative and symmetric melody, and so on. A triangle might be said to be good because it has straight sides with many thin lines. A man might be said to be good because he sacrifices for his family. Therefore, good is not said of the man, music, or triangle in exactly the same sense, since different perfections appertain to each, and therefore good is not being univocally predicated of the three. On the other hand, good is not being said of the three in totally different senses, as in the bad example above, which is just a play on words. But there really does seem to be something in a man that causes us to say that he's good, to whatever extent that he is good, and also something in the drawing of a triangle that causes us to say that it is a good triangle, in the sense of a good specimen or a great example of a triangle. And the same for the musical work. So it seems it's not equivocal either. Furthermore, it is not the same thing being noticed among these various examples, man, music, and triangle and such, in which case we would simply be speaking univocally, as though we were just noticing that the three, the man, music, and triangle, all had straight sides, and that's why they're all good. The man making this comment hasn't yet understood what analogy is, and how it's distinct from univocity. Instead, it is the proportional unity of the diverse goods present in things, each according to what it is, that's of interest here, not noticing unification by some exactly identical reality shared among them, as both dog and man both really have animality, where animal is said in the same way of both dog and man. Much work has been done on analogical predication, both by scholastics and their commentators, on the way in which predications may be analogically done. There are a few varieties worth pointing out, such as the analogy of attribution, in which something is predicated of another because it is a sign, or cause, or effect of the predicate, which is primarily in another. To use the Thomistic formula, according to intention or notion, but not according to being, or esse. A stock example of this is the statement, this food is healthy. Now, a man is what's principally said to be healthy, not food. For health can only be said to be in a man. And being healthy is said of the food here because it is a cause of health in a man. Although it is analogy, it is firmly based in reality if the food really is a cause of health in a man. So it isn't fanciful speech to say that food can be healthy. Another example of attribution is when something is a sign of the predicate. For example, if a physician says, your blood pressure is very healthy. Again, health only properly and primarily exists in a man, and here the blood pressure is a sign of the man being healthy. But again, saying that a blood pressure is healthy isn't fanciful speech, as though we're just making stuff up or playing on words, for it is firmly grounded in the reality of what makes a man healthy, its corresponding signs, and the relation drawn between the things analogized. Another sort of analogy, which is analogy in its most proper sense, is the analogy of proper proportionality, sometimes schematized as A is to B, as C is to D, in that A is not the same thing as C, and B is not the same thing as D, but there's a proportion, A to B and C to D, which makes the analogy not just fanciful speech. As St. Thomas would say, this analogy is done according to both intention or notion and being or esse. A stock example of this is when I say things like, the mind sees the truth of things. In this case, there is a proportionate similarity between the mind receiving truth and the eye receiving an object through sight, although seeing an object isn't exactly the same as mentally grasping or receiving a new truth. And notice when I say grasp there, I'm using another analogy. But the basis of statements like the mind is a sort of eye, and the mind sees the truth of things, is the proportion set up between the mind's reception of truth and the eye's reception of visual sense data, which is firmly grounded in the nature of the mind and in the nature of the eye. So this isn't fanciful speech, and it's not nonsense to say such things, and it's not a simple recognition of a common feature noted non-proportionally. Rather, the unity of diverse mental concepts signified by the same term, but those concepts being unified proportionally, not in the same way as animal and man is the same as animal and dog. Therefore, we have a true mean between univocity and equivocity at our disposal when we use analogy, which is based in reality and not fanciful. And we use this analogical language all the time, if only you have the eyes to see it. Analogical language, in my opinion, isn't per se theological either, and we use it in other areas of the intellectual life to grasp at realities which are more difficult to comprehend or tricky to communicate, since analogy allows us to sweep across facets of reality and speak without the demand or expectation that something is possessed in the analogates, or things being analogized, in exactly the same way. To put it another way, we would be quite restricted in our discourse if we demanded univocity and pretended as if proportional unity were not real. I would argue that the notion of a law of nature is a sort of analogy which is revealed as such in statements like, "This planet is governed by Kepler's law," in that the regularity and intelligibility of such a planetary motion has a proportionate similarity to a people being effectively and regularly governed by law, and that people aren't running wild on the streets doing whatever they'd like. I think few would say that law is being spoken of here in a univocal way, and that law for a state is the exact same thing as it is for a physical object, since what makes a planetary orbit regulated is not the same as what makes a society regulated, but each proportional to their own reality. That is, a law of nature is to a physical reality, as a state's law is to its subjects. I also doubt that few would say that this talk is fanciful or purely metaphorical, so the analogical mode here is quite fitting, specifically of proper proportionality, which is neither univocal nor equivocal. Just to recap, and perhaps repeat myself due to the importance of this thought, being is said of many things, of men, of trees, of cats, of rocks, etc. The question now is, in which of the above ways is it said of each? Univocally, analogically, or equivocally? Being is not said of all of the above in totally different ways, and the way our bat example was equivocal, since being at least has something to do with the actual existence of all the things in question, and not just a play on words. It is not equivocally predicated of things. Therefore, being is said either univocally or analogically of things. But if we return to the example involving animality and say that first, this man is an animal, and two, this dog is an animal, we can very well say that animal here is being said univocally, in the exact same way, of both man and dog so far as their animality is concerned. It doesn't signify one thing when said of a man, and something different when said of a dog. If we instead say, first, this man has being, and secondly, this dog has being, and ask the question of whether being here is said in the exact same way as animal in the previous example, we run into a problem when we try to understand how men and dogs could be distinguished with respect to being. In the case of animality, it's no problem, because what distinguishes men and dogs isn't more animality, rather something non-animal added to animality. The specific difference which picks out these sorts of animals specifically beyond generic animality. The problem is that when we say that first, this man has being, and secondly, this dog has being, and we're taking being to be univocal here, and mean the exact same thing when said of man and dog, it is not clear how a man could be distinguished from a dog. We cannot say that a man is not a dog because the man has being, but the dog has not being, because the dog really has being. So a man and a dog can only be distinguished here by non-being, that is to say, nothing, or non-being. But it makes absolutely no sense to say that a man is not a dog because the dog has some additional nothing that the man does not, or that the man has some additional nothing that the dog does not. Anything you could appeal to in order to make such a distinction would have to be more being. And again, you cannot point to this predicate said univocally of the man and a dog to make this distinction. That was just as in the above case, where I cannot say that a man is not a dog because the man is an animal, and the dog is also an animal. I cannot say that a man is not a dog because the man has being, and so does the dog, if being just has the same signification here. If I said that, you would rightly ask, then how are they different if they both have it? Our conclusion is that when being is said of many different things, then it cannot be said in the same exact way, that is, univocally. Therefore, we must rest with the remaining possibility, which is that being is said analogically, which is the analogia entis, or the analogy of being that I was talking about above. The peculiarity of being here seems to be the fact that beings are differentiated not by something which is non-being, as was in the case with animality, by adding on something outside of animality, but by the same, which is being. There's lots of stuff outside animality, but outside being, there's only non-being, or nothing. This analogy of being is a very fascinating idea, and you can see that we are led to this conclusion for reasons which are not at all theological, just from reasoning about how being is diversified and the sorts of questions a pre-Socratic might ask in thinking about the basis for the diversification of beings. These considerations of being, and further thinking about how being can be multiple, limited, and how change is possible, will further ground the real distinction of actuality and potentiality, or act and potency, which both have being analogically and are both not non-being. We'll see how this develops in future videos. This analogy of being also raises other interesting questions even before we approach precise arguments for the existence of God. A first example is that if the being of things is analogical through and through, and the beings of our daily experience have being in a restricted way, or in this or that mode, and only imperfectly or to a certain extent, this naturally prompts the intellectual move of using proportionality based on real experience with limited being to consider something which is, but not in a restricted or a limited mode of being, but simply is without further qualification, and has being unrestricted and uncircumscribed, utterly unlike the things of our daily experience. Of this being unqualified, we have to say that it possesses the fullness of being, because of this lack of limitation or being in a particular mode, and to which no perfection of being can be added, and that all other limited beings, though they have being, are finite and restricted reflections of this fullness of being, though distinct from it. Furthermore, this being unqualified would have to be absolutely independent, since there's nothing else that it could depend on that isn't already contained in its being in some way. Furthermore, the analogicity of being entails that the to be in finite being can be analogically transferred in arguments in natural theology to the to be of unlimited being as effect to cause. And this transfer is not univocal, as if unlimited being exists in just the same way as does a dog or man or any other finite being, since being is not said of all of these univocally. These are just thoughts that the analogy of being should prompt upon further contemplation, and one does have to take this idea of being unqualified seriously, and something which, in my judgment, natural theology demonstrates. Furthermore, metaphysical naturalism, which claims that only nature or the natural order exists, has very little plausibility when thinking about this ascent which is made from restricted being to being unqualified using proportionality. The class, so-called material being, purports to be just the same as being for the naturalist. But as we've seen, being cannot be a genus, and so it must contain all its differences, since outside of being is nothing, whereas a genus does not contain its differences. Furthermore, since materiality, physicality, or corporeality aren't nothing, they also already have being, and are already included in being, and so do not add anything to being not already there, other than express the mode of being, that is, being as corporeal being, or being as material being. And there's absolutely no reason to think at this point that it's the only mode of being, since being is not generically unified by any such class like material being or corporeal being. There might be, for all the naturalist knows, a real mode of being alongside material being, which would be immaterial and has an essence proportioned to its active existence, just as the essence of an electron as material being is proportioned to the electron's active existence. So being is not necessarily reducible or coextensive with so-called material being, just considering the intrinsic analogicity of being. The analogy perceived in the diversity of material being from man to dogs to trees suffices to show that so-called material being is a limited mode of being. But that which is limited cannot contain the principle of its own limitation, and so must be limited by a broader principle than simply so-called material being. And there's absolutely no reason at this point to make the identification between physical or natural being and being as such. This opens the door not only to being unqualified, but to separated substances. All of this is on the table when we consider the analogy of being, and how what we see in our daily experience is only a finite mode of being, and so the mind must at least consider the possibility of such being which is not seen in mundane experience, but exists nonetheless in a way proportioned to its essence, just as natural and corporeal beings are proportioned to their essences.